Good evening. Tonight we're going to start in the 8th century BC. And I'm going to start you with a legend. There was two twin brothers that washed ashore on the Italian peninsula. Now these brothers had been cast off trying to be killed, but they washed ashore. Now these brothers were raised by wolves. And these brothers grew up together and grew to be quite the pair in the region. Now the brothers had a disagreement. They wanted to build a city, but they had a disagreement as to where to build it and what to name it. They settled this argument by the first brother, Romulus, killing his brother, Remus. And he got to name the town Rome. And that's where we're going to start tonight, is the city or the empire, the republic, however you want to look at it, of Rome. Now we're going to start in 753 BC. That is when the city was built. Now, if you know your geography, we're talking about Rome is in Italy. Rome is just a very small little spot in its beginning. So it is surrounded by many settled people groups that are already taking over the peninsula. So you've got, right around it, you've got the Latin peoples, which were commonly considered part of the Roman Empire, or Roman peoples. You have the Italics, you have the Etruscans, you have the Gauls, and you have the Greek colonies on the coast. So this is where Rome starts. Not a great big starting for a city. But at its beginning, what does a city need in order to flourish? First thing you need to have a city when you're building one is people. So when Romulus built the city, he put out a proclamation to the world at large and said, anyone who comes to my city will be granted asylum from whoever is seeking them. Well, who usually is seeking asylum? Who's trying to get away from people? Crooks, criminals, escaped slaves, fugitives, exiled people, and that's who came. That's what Rome was made up of in the very beginning. Now, Rome had a second problem. With the peoples that came with the fugitive, very few women came. And so the city was primarily male-dominated. It's kind of hard to keep a city alive whenever you can't propagate the species, you can't grow. And so Romulus went out to the neighbors and said, please let us have some of your women so that we can continue as a city and thrive. And the neighbors said, no. So Romulus took a different tact. What he did is he invited the Sabines. It's a neighboring people. And he invited them over to a celebration, the festival of Kronos. And this was held at the Circus Maximus. It was a giant arena. And the Sabines came and they were celebrating, they were having a good time. And during that time, the Romans went out and abducted all the Sabine women and brought them back to Rome. Now, the Sabines were not going to take this laying down. When they got home, they figured out their women were gone. And so they rallied and they came back to Rome to take Rome. Now, Rome did stop them the first time. Now, the Sabines went back and they rallied and started to come a second time. And an interesting thing happened on the second time. The Sabine women came out, the ones that had been abducted. And they said to the king of the Sabines, please, no more war. We don't want to be husbandless and fatherless. And so a war was averted by the Sabine women. Now, they did decide that they were going to have a co-reignship. They signed a treaty. They were going to mingle the two nations together, the two groups together. And so Romulus agreed to co-rule with Titus Tertius, the king of the Sabines. And they ruled for about 8 years. And this worked well for them. The cultures mingled. They got a bigger people group, and it worked well for them. Now, about 8 years into the reign, Titus Tertius tried to do some things that were against Romulus, and Romulus had him assassinated. So Romulus was now the sole king once again. And this worked out well for everybody. Nobody seemed to have a problem with this. Now, this begins the Roman kingdom. Now, there were 7 kings of the Roman kingdom. I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first king is King Romulus. So he is the one that founds it. He also founds the Roman Senate. Now, the Senate was a little bit different than what we see later on in history, but the Senate was essentially just an advisory council to the king. That's all they were. But they were, remember, this was just the people that the way I envision this is whenever he put out that decree saying anybody who comes gets to, more or less the first in gets to be on the Senate, and they used to who's running the Senate at the beginning. That's what I'm guessing, but I don't know that. But it's like the first come, first serve, and they are in the Senate. Second king comes through, King Numa Pompilius. Now, he is a Sabine king. The Sabine people get together and say, look, we've had a Roman king long enough. It's our turn. Let's have a Sabine king. And the Romans are okay with this. So we have a Sabine king come in. This king creates and establishes the Roman religion as they knew it and as it lasted through the next 500, 700 years. The third king was Tullus Hostilius. Now, he's a Latin king. They've decided to alternate back and forth between Sabine and Roman kings. So this king comes in, and his entire reign, he's at war with somebody. There was never a time of peace under his reign. Then in 640 BC, we have Ancus Marcius. He is a Sabine king, so they've alternated back. He is the one noted for building the first aqueducts. So the city is now large enough, it is becoming more and more populated, that they have to start building infrastructure to supply it and support it. So this is kind of telling you, even this early on, it is going to be a very large city. Then you have Tarquinius Priscus. He is an Etruscan king. That comes from the northern province, and so they become part of the Roman kingdom. And this Etruscan king is a very well-respected individual. He's very generous to the people, and that's what he is known for. And everybody's okay with him being ruler. He was an advisor to the one before him. Then you have Servius Tullus. This is the first king. Well, let me back up because I've skipped a step. Every king up until this point has been elected by the Senate. So it's put up to a vote, and the Senate elects the king. Kind of an interesting way of a kingship being passed down, but they elect it. This is the first time that a king is appointed instead of being elected. A king is decided, and Servius Tullus is put in. Now, he is also noted for being the one to create the census, something that is on our minds right now because we're going through a census here in 2020. During the time of Jesus, that was the time of a census. This is the first census taken in Rome, is under this king. The seventh and final king is Tarquinius Superbus. Now, he's a character known for nothing good. He and his son more or less take power from the last king. They execute the last king and they take power. And the son, how should I put it delicately, takes advantage of one of the local women and is not nice about it. The woman is very well known amongst the people. And she goes out to the people and cries out what has been done to her. And she commits suicide. She is so begrieved by what's happened. And the people revolt. They said, okay, enough's enough. These guys are terrible. We're getting them out. And they run the king and his son out of town. And the people decide, we are done with kings altogether. We're going to have the Senate run the show. And so from this day forward, there are no more kings in Rome. The Roman Republic is born. It is completely controlled by the Senate. Now, from this period, just so we're kind of clear on this period is, writings from this time are very scarce. Because in 390 BC, several hundred years later, the Gauls moved into Rome, leveled the city, and wiped out all the records from this time frame. So most of the stuff lives in halfway in legend, halfway in fact. So just be noted, I've told you that before, is the further back in history you go, the harder it is to verify. Some of these facts are not 100% facts. I'm presenting them and I'm giving you that disclaimer now. Guy raised by wolves kind of gives you an indication of what's going on with that. So we move into the Republic of Rome, 509 BC. Now the Republican Senate, there were two classes of people in Rome at the time. There was what was known as the patricians and there were the plebeians. Now the patricians were of noble blood. The nobility came down the line from if you were part of the Roman Senate under Romulus, you were of noble blood. And so this line had been carried forward for 200 years, and they were the ones that had the control. They were the only ones allowed to run for governmental office. They were the only ones allowed in the Senate. Now the plebeians made up everybody else. They were the commoners. Now that does not necessarily mean that they were poor. You had wealthy plebeians. They just didn't come of noble stock. Now in 494 BC, so just 5 to 10 years after the Roman Republic is born, the plebeians say, look, we want representation on this Senate. We don't have any control over what's going on, and they have the majority of the population. So they say, we're not going to do anything. They went on strike. They said, we're not going to work for you. We're not going to serve you. We're not going to serve in your armies until you give us representation. Patricians had no choice but to give them representations, and they created a new council called the Concilius Plebis, so the Council of the Plebeians. Now they were an organization of their own, They governed the plebeians. So you have the Senate that controls everybody and the plebeius council that controls the plebeians. They didn't really mingle too much, but that's how they set up their government. Now, on top of that, there were a few other things to note about the Roman governance. They had lots of different positions, committees, assemblies, and so on, just like any government does. But one of the things that they had was the consul's position. Now, a consul is a single individual that is elected for a one-year term, and he has to come from the Senate, but he is voted upon by the people. So if you were a citizen of Rome, you could vote for your consul. In addition to that, there was always two consuls. Now, the consuls had power over the Roman Senate. They were the ones that proposed laws and enacted them. They had control of the armies. They had really a lot of control, and the only one that could overrule or veto a council was another consul. So that's why you always had two. Now, this was a great checks and balances for the Roman Republic because it kept one man from ever getting too much power. It's a great way of doing it if you have two men in equal position power, and one can stop the other. Now, a consul could do anything they wanted while in power. But, so whether it's legal or illegal, they could do anything they wanted. But as soon as they came off the consul's position, within 12 months, they only had a one-year term, and they could not run for re-election. Once they came off, they could be prosecuted for anything they did illegally while being a consul. I find that interesting in today's day and age. We just went through an impeachment. We can actually charge a guy while he's in office. The Romans could not. I find that interesting. Now, this worked very well. Thinking about it from a consul's position, a consul could go on to be a governor, a proconsul, some other position, and become very wealthy if he kept his nose clean and didn't do anything to aggravate the people. So whenever they left, they didn't want to anger anybody because they wanted to make sure everything was kosher and kept going through. So you had a lot of good consuls during this period. But the Republic lasts from 509 BC up until almost the turn of the BC AD era. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But it lasts for almost 500 years. And our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is based a lot upon the original Constitution of the Roman Republic. And you think about all the checks and balances we have developed in our Constitution. It was based on what the Republic did. And so that's just kind of an interesting note there. Now, the Roman Republic had one major enemy during its time, and that was the city of Carthage. Carthage was on the northern coast of Africa. It was a very big naval power on the Mediterranean Sea. They had all the boats. The Romans had no navy. They really didn't have a naval force. They had a good land force, but they didn't have a naval force. And Carthage decides to expand a little bit further, and they start moving into Sicily, the island between Italy and Carthage. And they start coming into Sicily. Well, the Romans don't want that. They don't want them encroaching upon their land, so the Romans go to war with Carthage. Now, when you don't have boats, it's kind of hard to wage a sea battle, so they wage land battle as much as they can. They build their first fleet of ships, which they don't know how to build, and they don't know how to man, and they don't know how to sail, so the first fleet goes down. They strike out with a little bit of luck. A Carthaginian ship runs aground on Roman territory. So they take the specs from this Carthaginian ship, and they build one just like it, and build 1,000 more just like it. And now they can go to war with at sea because they have ships that will sail. In fact, they've even improved it. They built a gangway on top of it that whenever dropped could actually impale another ship, and the soldiers could run across and take over another ship. Great idea. Problem is, the gangplank was so heavy it made the ship top heavy. And in a storm, it turned it over. There goes the second fleet. So the Romans just kind of gave up on the navy deal. They just said, okay, we're just going to stick with the land battles. They do have a navy to some degree, but nothing as prominent as the Carthaginians. But the first war is called the First Punic War. This is where they fight on Sicily's soil. They try to run Carthage back home, and they succeed. They run it all the way back to Carthage, and they sign a peace treaty, and they say, okay, enough. And it was a very bloody war on both sides. Both sides took a lot of losses. Now, the second war takes place when Hannibal comes in. Now, Hannibal takes the western route to Italy. He lands in Spain, and he goes up the Spanish coast and down and into Italy and starts trying to take over Rome that way. He goes over the Alps with several thousands and thousands of men. And he comes in the dead of winter, which is not exactly a good time to be traveling, and loses, I think it was 35,000 men trying to cross the Alps. that's how many he lost. Think about how many he took. But he comes in and he starts waging war. He wages a 16-year war in Italy, trying to take over Rome. And Romans keep pushing him back and keep pushing him back, and he keeps coming. And finally, the Romans say, look, we can't keep doing this, so we're going to go, all of his armies up here, we're going to go take Carthage. And so they go to Carthage, and they start waging war against Carthage on their home turf. Well, Carthage calls back Hannibal and says, come back, we're under siege, please come and help us. Hannibal comes back, and Hannibal is defeated on his home turf. This time, the Romans' peace treaty is a little bit sterner with Carthage. It's more, they didn't call it that, but it's more like sanctions they placed upon Carthage. Carthage had to pay 200 talents of gold for the next 50 years to Rome. Carthage had to give up its navy. And Carthage could not go to war with anyone without the approval of the Roman Senate. Now, it wasn't under a Roman province. Carthage was still on its own, but more or less Rome was going to take on Carthage if they stepped out of line. And so ended the Second Punic War. Now, the Third Punic War starts 50 years later. The sanctions are over, everything's lifted, and Carthage says, finally, we can go back to war. And they invade a neighbor. They go to war with a neighboring country. And the Roman Senate says, we didn't give them permission to go to war again. Yes, they didn't have to pay us the 200 talents, but they still can't go to war without our permission. Carthage has just got to be destroyed. And Rome does that. They sail down to Carthage, and within a couple of years, they had wiped out Carthage off the map. So ends the Third Punic War. Now Rome controls the seas, and they control the Mediterranean. They now have the power. One thing I found during the archaeological digs and such, this is what Carthage was expected to have looked like. I just found this a fascinating picture. You know, whether it's 100% accurate or not, I can't claim. But think about this. This is 200, 300 BC, and they're building a marina like that. It's beautiful. I mean, and this is one of those places you just don't hear much about. I mean, for something that was a powerhouse in the region. So I just find that pretty neat there. Now, Rome continues to expand. They have the Macedonian Wars where they take on Greece, then they take on Spain, and then they start going into the Gauls, and they're just kind of expanding a little bit at a time. But with that expansion comes a few problems. Primarily the fact that everybody's wanting now to be represented in the Roman Senate. And so this is causing a bit of a problem because you've got two factions. You've got the Optimates and you've got the Populares. The Optimates say the Senate is supreme, the Senate is pure, they are the ones that are supposed to run everything. The Populares are the ones that have the social reform on the agenda. They want equal rights. They want representation. And the Populares were not only the Greeks and the Spanish, it was including the plebeians. They still want better representation within their own Senate. So, you have this unrest starting to form. And in I picked one general just to kind of give you an example of what was going on at this time. But this is a general, his name is Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix. I'm going to call him Sulla from now on because that's what he's recorded on in history. Sulla is an Optimate. He is one that believes in the supremacy of the Senate. And he is appointed by the Senate to go to war in a distant land. And he's appointed to say, okay, get your army and get ready to go. As Sulla is getting ready to go, the Populares take over the Senate. Or they start moving into the Senate. And the Populares say, actually, Sulla, no, you're not going to go and do this. Sulla's already ready to go. He says, He comes into the Roman Senate, and he wipes out the Populares and runs them out. And he puts the Optimates back in their place, and he goes to war. He succeeds. He comes back in victory, and when he walks into Rome, the Populares have come back. So he takes his army, and he runs the Populares out again. But this time he does something a little bit different. He comes in, and he gets himself elected as one of the consuls. Now, in addition to a consul, he was also deemed a dictator. Now, they actually elected dictators back then. A dictator was a man that had supreme control. He couldn't be overridden by another consul. He had supreme control over the armies, over the Senate, over the laws enacted, everything. He could do whatever he wanted for 6 months. And then his term was over. Okay. What he did when he was dictator, he came in, first thing he did is he executed all the Populares. Got rid of them first. Then he rewrote the Constitution of the Republic to give more power to the Senate. Third thing he did is limit the power of the plebeian council. So he's more or less setting up the Republic to be even sterner than it was before against the populares. Now, this was not a one-time occurrence. This happened in one form or fashion several times for the last century of the Roman Republic. But this is kind of the last one before we come to the next phase in Roman history. So we move into what we know as today the First Triumvirate. Now, the Triumvirate was made up of three men. They were politicians/generals. Now, we know them as Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Now, with the Roman Republic, it was very, very difficult for one man to control everything. They designed it to where that couldn't happen. But with three guys that were allied together, they could get things done. And that's what these three guys did. They formed a secret alliance to achieve mutual goals, which was to control the country, or control the Republic. Now, the first man is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey the Great to you guys. Pompey was a man from a wealthy senatorial family. He is one of the aristocrats, the patricians. And he comes in with this heritage. And he is a military strategist. He is a general. He is a very well-known general. And he's very well respected. The term Pompey the Great was given to him by the people. He was an inspirational leader, supported by the Roman peoples. He is the one credited with taking on Judea and taking over Judea for the Roman Republic. He's the one that brought them in. Now, he's also credited with, after his successes, he was given 120,000 men and 500 ships to purge the Mediterranean of all of its pirates. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but think about it. The Mediterranean's a big place, 500 ships, and he was able to get rid of all of the pirates. That would be hard to do today. It can't be done today. You can't even get rid of pirates in Somalia right now. He was able to eliminate the pirate threat in the Mediterranean with just 500 ships and just 120,000 people. It's a pretty impressive guy. He knows his strategy. He knows his warfare. So he is a very impressive and important person. Now, the next person to look at is Marcus Licinius Crassus. Now, he is a co-consul with Pompey the Great. Now, that's one thing I forgot to say. Pompey the Great was one of the consuls, and he was a co-consul with Crassus. Crassus and Pompey did not like each other at all. They were enemies. However, they were allied enemies. If that makes any sense to you. They got along for mutual benefit, but they did not like each other. He is a co-consul with them. However, Crassus is allied with Julius Caesar. Crassus is one of the most wealthy men in the Roman world. And Julius Caesar has a tendency to overspend, and Crassus keeps bailing him out. So they're pretty good friends if Crassus keeps paying all of Caesar's bills. But that alliance is formed there. Now, Crassus decides he's been seeing Pompey take his lands and bring lands into the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar is doing the same thing over on the Western Front. And so Crassus says, I want to bring in the Parthian Empire. And so he sets off to take over the Parthian Empire. Parthia is Persia to the rest of us. That's where we consider it, Persia. Apparently, Crassus is not as good a military commander as Pompey or Julius Caesar because he dies before he really gets started. And so he dies in the triumvirate. Julius Caesar. We move on to Julius. Now, this is the guy we know the most about because of his a lot of the things he did. So Julius Caesar starts his military career in 81 BC, and he is soon to be an unstoppable force when it comes to military might. He takes over Great Britain twice. He lands in Britain and takes Britain twice. He takes over the Gauls, which was a very powerful enemy, except for they were factions, tribal factions, and so he was able to pit one against another. And so he was able to weasel his way and take over Gaul and bring that in. He's taken the front, more or less the entire western side of Europe for the Republic of Rome. Now, Caesar ends this triumph with a civil war. See, one of the things that the triumvirate want was ultimate power. And that kind of alliance can only last so long whenever one guy wants the power. Well, Crassus dies, the triumvirate fails, and now you have Pompey against Caesar, both with large standing armies. Caesar has the Western Europe, and Pompey has the eastern part of Europe and Judea. They go to war with one another. And Pompey is defeated, and he flees to Egypt. Now, once he gets to Egypt, this is not a Roman colony yet. This has not been taken by the Romans. He gets to Egypt, and he's met by King Ptolemy, the Pharaoh Ptolemy the 13th. Ptolemy doesn't want to have anything to do with the Romans, so he executes Pompey and gives him back to Caesar, and says, I don't want to have any dealings with Rome. So he doesn't want any trouble. Now, Caesar comes back, eventually considers himself a victor, and he takes over Egypt. He actually executes Ptolemy the 13th and puts a new pharaoh on the throne, Pharaoh Cleopatra. Queen Cleopatra, we know that name. And so she is now the new Ptolemaic ruler and the last Ptolemaic ruler of Rome. Julius goes back to Rome in a success, and he is greeted by thunderous applause by the Roman people. And he is named Dictator for Life. It's a new title, never been done, but now he is supreme leader over Rome. Now that's a good thing and a bad thing. It depends on how you look at it. He now has complete control. He got exactly what he wanted. The thing is, there are still people in Rome that don't want that. And two of them that come to mind are Brutus and Cassius. They are two aristocrats, two patricians that don't want the supreme power going to one man. They want the Senate power. And so they assassinate Julius Caesar. Now they flee to Greece, and so starts the next phase. Julius Caesar had no legitimate heir to the throne by birth. He had groomed his great-nephew, Octavius, to be the successor Caesar, or the successor to him, and that's what his will had stated. So now the new ruler is Octavius. Octavius is 18 years old, kind of a kid, and he's off at school. He's not even in the country at the time that he takes power. He's off at school. The man that takes over at the moment is one of his right-hand generals, Mark Antony. Mark Antony rallies the people together because the people were in support of Julius Caesar. And they say, he rallies them, and this is that phrase that comes, friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. Mark Antony's speaking that at the funeral of Julius Caesar. He says, we must stop Cassius and Brutus. We must not let them survive from this travesty and treason. So Mark Antony gets together an army, and he pays for it out of Julius's bank account, which is not his. He's just the caretaker of it. But he's more or less kind of already setting up the stage that Mark Antony wants to kind of take over everything. So he's in the right place at the right time so he can do what he wants. Well, he goes to war in Greece to take on Cassius and Brutus. Sorry, Cassius came along before. But while he's over at war, Octavius comes back. And Mark Antony wins the war, comes back, finds Octavius on the throne, and say, okay, we'll get together on this. And they create the second triumvirate. So it's Mark Antony, Octavius, and another general, Lepidus. Now these generals get together and they want to control they want to do some reconfiguring of the nation, so we're going to work together on this. Because Mark Antony can't really oust Octavius. He is the legitimate heir. He can't really do it on his own. So they go out and they start going to the different provinces of Rome, the places that were conquered. Make sure everybody's going to fall in line with the new regime. Everybody knows where they stand. Well, Mark Antony meets somebody while he's out there. He meets a lady named Cleopatra. And she's trouble for every man she meets. Cleopatra gets the idea. You know what? This is just a kid. I think we can take Rome. And Cleopatra wants to make a run at the emperorship. And Mark Antony thinks that's a great idea. And so Cleopatra and Mark Antony and their armies try to take Rome. Octavius is smart for an 18-year-old, and he has the people behind him as well as a large army. And they defeat Cleopatra and Mark Antony. And Cleopatra heads for home with her ships. Mark Antony says, wait for me, and he comes after them. And Mark Antony's military says, we ain't doing this. This is not what we signed up for. And they give him to the Egyptians and say, you can have him. Now, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they end up killing themselves, and we know that part of the story, that nice romanceful end. Octavius comes to the throne, and he takes the title of Caesar, his great-uncle's name. And Caesar becomes a title, meaning supreme leader, supreme power. That name lived on for centuries. In fact, it was even used in this century, believe it or not. It's changed a bit. It's known as the Kaiser. Or, in Russian, the Tsar. It's been translated so many times, and it's been used even in today's day and age. It meant supreme leader, supreme power. And with this name came this title. The Roman Senate gave him a new name. They called him Caesar Augustus. Now we know that name ourselves. If you look in Luke 2, in that time, Caesar Augustus called for a census to be done. And that is the time of the birth of Christ. So now you know where you sit in the Roman history. And next time, I'm going to start there and we'll finish it out. So that's where I'm ending it out tonight. So thank you all for your attendance. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it.